So to get started, I'll ask Peggy. So Peggy, how long have you lived here?
I have lived here 50 years.
Okay. When were you born?
I was born in the south part of the Texas Panhandle, between Amarillo and Lubbock, about halfway in between. It was a little town called Hart, Texas.
Okay. And what year were you born?
1934.
Okay. How did your parents come to Texas?
Well, my parents had lived down in the Ranger, Eastland part of Texas when they were growing up. And the Ranger oil boom, they were there at the time of the oil boom. And so they stayed until the war was over and the boom was over. And by that time, the cotton boll had the cotton weevil had pretty well destroyed the cotton fields. You couldn't raise cotton anymore, and that's all they can raise in that country was peanuts and cotton. And they had made a little money in the oil field, and so they decided it was time to leave East Texas. And so they were just a young couple, had one child, a baby almost, and they loaded her up and decided to move to the Texas Panhandle, which has always had a bad reputation for being cold. And so my grandfather thought they were out of their mind because he took his money and went to Harlingen, Texas, down on the border where it stays warm the year round. So he went south, and my daddy and mother come north, and they bought a farm and have been in Hart, Texas ever since then.
So what did they farm?
Mostly, when they first come, back in the early days, it was mostly wheat and grain sorghum. But then later, in that area, they started farming cotton and corn. And it's a huge ag area now, lots of crops raised.
So why did you come to New Mexico?
Well, when I got married, my husband and his family had always rented land. And it's hard to rent land year in and year out because things change. The land can sell, or the brother-in-law might come in and want to farm it. It wasn't very secure. And so my daddy told my husband, he said, we're just going to go buy a place. He said, this is silly. I think we had been married 8 years. And the one that we was renting from at the end was an eccentric, very eccentric, weird kind of man. And I don't care if this goes on. That's when my daddy said, this is enough. So my husband and my daddy loaded up, come to Hart, found a real estate agent, and we bought a farm just over into New Mexico.
When would that be?
That was in, 50 years ago? That was in 66. Okay. I won't be here 50 years until January the 10th of next year, but it's close.
So you said your parents were farmers, right? Did they experience anything with the Dust Bowl?
Yes, they went through the Dust Bowl. They moved there in about 1919, and so they were well established in the Dust Bowl days. And it affected that area of Texas almost as much as it did up here around Boise City and Dalhart and that area. It was still a little bad down there. And they had to, in fact, my daddy said that he would have lost that farm if his uncle hadn't stepped in and kind of gave him enough money to make payments on it and kept it like that. And then as soon as the Dust Bowl was over and it began to rain again, well, then he just gave it back to my daddy. But that's how he got through the Dust Bowls. And they always had eggs and cream. And if that was enough to buy groceries with, then that's all the money they had. He was in on the part of the Dust Bowl in Depression days that they killed the cattle. So that was a very bad time.
Did he ever talk about that?
Yes, he did. He loved his cattle. He was that kind of guy that he had dairy cattle, and you keep them year in and year out, and you get really, really attached to them. And of course, we keep our cows the year in, year out too. We've got the cow-calf operation, but yeah, that was hard. That was hard.
So how did you have any memories of the Great Depression at all?
Not many, just real vaguely. I can remember maybe one time feeling afraid because we were headed for a cellar, and my folks wasn't. We wasn't afraid of tornadoes or anything. We didn't run to the cellar every time a cloud come up, but we were headed for a cellar, and I remember that, and I don't know why, but it was just maybe it was because it was so different.
Yeah.
But as far as actually, because I was born in '34, right in the middle of the Dust Bowl, and so I was pretty little by the time I was old enough to remember.
How old were you when you ran into the cellar?
I couldn't have been over 2, probably. Maybe her age, that age again, yeah, 2 or 3. And that's all I really remember about her. Of course, I remember Mother talking about it a lot and how hard it was to keep the house halfway decent. And something I was doing the other day, and I never had even thought about it being different. Jimmy, my youngest son, he said, and this has just been in the last month, he said, "Why do you always turn your glasses upside down in the cabinet?" And I said, "Well, because Mother always did." And it dawned on me then, that's the reason she did it, is to keep the dust out of them. But I just did it because Mother always did. But you know, just little interesting things like that.
What else? Did she ever put like wet sheets on the windows or anything?
Yeah, and you know, all of the history we've done with everybody, I don't know how they communicated that or if it was just from figuring it out on their own. But when you talk to people that went through the Dust Bowl days, everyone used about the same method to keep as much dust out as they could.
Since you were a baby, did your mom ever tell you what she did to keep you healthy?
She said at one time I had pneumonia, and she was really, really worried about me because there was a lot of dust pneumonia back in those days. And she was real concerned about that.
So, as a kid, what did you do for fun? You grew up on a farm. Was it cows and crops, or was it just cows?
It was crops, and when I was a small child, my daddy milked cows by hand, and he sold cream. And then when I was about 13 years old, he changed over to a grade A dairy and built a dairy barn, and then we milked cows with a machine. And after he did that, we always had hard help to help do the milking. And of course, my daddy would do some of it too. Sometimes I milked with the machines, but and then I never did milk by hand. I was like Yolanda. I never did have to milk a cow by hand.
So what did you do for fun when you were a child?
Oh, we played we had the WPA days had a program where you could go by elm trees and you'd plant windbreaks. That's trying to do everything they could to keep the wind from blowing again, or the soil from blowing. And so my daddy signed up for that, and you'd go to the county seat, which was Dingett, and the trees had come in there. And they'd let you know when the trees had come, and you'd go pick them up, and then you'd plant them. And so we had a kind of an L-shaped windbreak with lots and lots of trees. And of course, living out here, trees are really fun. So I spent most of my time playing in those trees, in the windbreaks. And we rode a bicycle. Of course, it was on a dirt road. And for fun in the house, I played paper dolls and card games. We loved card games, colored books.
Did anyone in your family work for the WPA? Did any of them get an income?
I don't believe they did. Now, a lot of people up here did. I was hoping Chester would tell you this morning his daddy worked for the WPA at one time, but it didn't come up. But I can't think of many people down there that actually worked for the WPA. But a funny story about the trees, I'll tell it to you. When they called, and they didn't call, we didn't have telephones, but they sent a letter saying the trees was in, My older brother by that time, he was just out of school probably. He's probably 19 years old, still there. It was before he went to the service. And he was still there helping Daddy farm. And Daddy told him to take the stock trailer and go get those trees. So they backed up the pickup to the stock trailer, and he went to Dimick, it was about 20 miles from our house, to pick up the trees, and you could have carried them out in a grocery sack. You put them in the front seat of the pickup ball. But we always laughed about that. But those trees did grow up to be big trees.
He was ready.
Yeah.
So how many siblings did you have?
I have 2 brothers and 1 sister. Both of my brothers have passed away, but my sister is 16 years older than myself, and she's still living by herself. She's 97 years old.
Wow.
And now she could, and I have asked her to tell me about the Dust Bowl days, because she was in teenager. She could remember a lot about it. And she never has. She said, I don't want to remember. So,
Yeah.
so I guess it was bad.
And did they all stay around here or did they leave?
My brother that just passed away in March, he stayed and farmed the place that Daddy had bought. In fact, he passed away in March, and in April that land had been in our family for 100 years. And now then his grandsons are farming it. So, well, they're not really farming it, they've leased it to a big farmer. All this land is going to the big farmers, because you have to have lots and lots of big equipment. And
So would you say a lot of the farms in this area are larger farms, that the land is leased out rather than just a small farm?
Yeah. There's most of the farming and ranching in this area is done on a big scale, big scale.
So when did that change, Peggy?
I guess the last probably 15 years, it's began to, it was a gradual change. Part of it had to do with the farm program. The farm program, the more land you farmed, the better your benefits was. And then the ranching, it started in with big ranchers buying up the neighbors' small ranches. And so some of the ranches are huge now.
So do you live on a farm now, a working farm?
Yeah, I live on the same farm that my husband and I bought when we moved to New Mexico, so it's 50 years. We've had it 50 years.
So what do you still grow wheat and?
We have wheat and milo, and we quit growing corn last year because our water's beginning to get a little weaker. Not real bad, but it takes less water for wheat and milo than it does corn. And we've just now, this year we're in the process of changing over from my daughter and her husband. When my husband passed away, they bought the broke out land, the farmland from me, and they've been farming it for about 6 years.
So we're going to step back just a little bit. You were talking about your childhood, so let's talk about your school. Where you went to school and kind of what your school was like.
I went to a small school. It wasn't quite as small as Amistad, but I imagine for the 12 grades, it probably had 300 kids. Amistad was always right around 120 to 130, and my school was about, the biggest it ever got was around 300. So it was a small school. I think there was 12 in my graduating class.
What year did you graduate?
What year did I graduate? That is 53.
What was your favorite subject in school?
History and geography. That's the reason I like it. That's the reason I hated math. Don't make me do math.
So what did you do after high school?
After high school, I was kind of like Yolanda said, I didn't ever have any aspiration to go to college. That was back when we visited a few campuses before I graduated. I don't know if you ever heard this or not, or you probably know it. Back then, if you went to college, you had to wear matching shoes, and your clothes had to match, and everything had to be just all nice and fancy. And I looked around on the campus, and I thought, I don't think this is and then it was so funny because when my kids started to college, well, then it had turned kind of the other way.
Yeah.
And then when my grandkids started, now that was, I'd go to orientation with them, and they're wearing their pajamas on.
So it's changed.
It changed a lot.
So when did you meet your husband?
Like I said, he had always rented. His father had always rented land, and so they were kind of newbies in the community. And when they moved there, he was already out of high school. He was having his dad farm, but his brother was still one grade ahead of me. His brother was a senior, and so I went to the graduation of his brother. Of course, every time you had graduation, you went because you knew everybody, and he was there. And we was going to have a party out at my house when it was over. And I said, yeah, come on out. We don't, he was kind of new to the community, so that's how we started dating.
To step back, she asked what you did after high school. So I know you didn't go to college.
Yeah, I didn't go to college. I went to work at an elevator, a grain elevator, weighing trucks. And that's the only job I ever had. And I didn't work there very long because it was during the fall. I'd already been going with my husband for a year when I graduated, and by the time the fall was over the next year, well, then we got married in the winter, and then I was always just a mother and housewife.
So you knew your husband only about a year or two before you got married?
Probably 2 years.
2 years.
Mm-hmm.
So you guys moved to New Mexico from Texas.
Mm-hmm.
What was that like? Was it?
Well, I adjusted to it real quick because I had never lived in town in my life. And the year before we moved up here, we rented a farm in Bovina. That's about 60 miles from Hart. We rented a farm, and it didn't have a house on it. So we had to rent a house in Bovina, and it's a little bitty town. It's about like Clayton, probably, maybe smaller. It's probably smaller than Clayton. And that was my first experience of living in town. And I had 6 children, all from 5th grade on down to little guys, and I hated it. I hated every part of it. So when my husband and my daddy decided this was insane, we was going to move, I was anxious to move up here. My mother wasn't too fond of it. She went over that road between Romero and Channing and said, "Oh my land," said she'll kill herself on that highway, but it wasn't that bad.
Okay.
How was the community different here from the community where you lived before?
Not a whole lot. It's because I was raised in an ag-related community and had lived there all my life, so I knew everybody in that community. And then and the first thing we did when we moved up here is my oldest kids got involved in 4-H club, and that got us acquainted with, between the church and the school and the 4-H club, you got acquainted really fast, even where they lived, although it's a big area to get used to as far as knowing where people live. In 4-H club they had summer tours, and we'd visit every one of the 4-H club's houses and look at their projects, their cattle and everything. So after the first summer, I had already been to everybody's house, and that helped a lot. I could put a face with where they lived after that.
So were you involved in any women's groups during that time as a way to get involved?
Not really, because I had 6 kids in school. Well, 2 of them started after we got here. I didn't really have time to do. The 4-H club kept me busy. I was a 4-H club leader, and that's what I was really busy with. And then the first year we lived here, well, my neighbor woman wanted to come, drove up in her car and said, "Do you want to help us with Vacation Bible School?" And I said, "Well, yes, I guess I can." And then I started helping with Vacation Bible School.
What year was that?
That was in '66.
And you're still helping.
Yeah, I'm still helping with Vacation Bible School. And that was a great way to get acquainted. It was fun.
Could you tell us about the Vacation Bible School?
Well, we have a really unique vacation Bible school here on account of we're out in the middle of nowhere. And if we just depended on the children to come that lives right here close by, we wouldn't have very many kids. So they had already started it, I think, 66. It started about 59. So it had been going on about 6 years. And they drew in kids from all the area, like Sedan and Mascaro and Narvasa, and people would bring their grandkids and invite their nieces and nephews, and they just come in from everywhere. And it was and we'd have it all day long. We'd go to Vacation Bible School schools to learn how to do this, and they'd say, you know, they'd give us kind of a schedule, and the lady that was in charge of it, which was Elma, she said, well, we can't do it like that at Amistad, because they come so far, we have it all day long. And they said, oh my land, you can't have it like that. And she said, but we do. And it works out really good. So we come about 8:30 in the morning, and we have crafts and music and sack lunches and programs, and go home about 3 o'clock in the afternoon. And this last year, I think we had 75 kids. I believe it was 75 kids. We have a class in that room, and a class in the basement, and 4 classes over in the community building.
And where do they come from?
I had one this year from Wisconsin. They come from everywhere. They come from everywhere.
Do they all have ties to this community?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, they've either got uncles or aunts or grandparents or great-grandparents or somebody tied to this community.
And how many of them stayed over at your house?
This last summer.
Yeah.
Well, I didn't have as many this last summer. I usually have anywhere from 6 to 8 at my house. And that's just recently. I mean, that's the great-grandkids' ages.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's what they do. Like Lynn, you know, Lynn and Karen, I think they had 17 at their house. That's my oldest son that was here a while ago. They just put up a bunch of tents, and they just come and stay for the week.
Are those people that are in your family, or are they also just friends of your family?
Most of it's
too?
just family.
But the
Because like I say,
17?
I had 6 kids, so I got
Yeah.
lots of great-grandkids. I could almost have a vacation Bible school by myself. Yeah.
So how would you, what does it mean to live in this community of Amistad to you?
Well, like I say, it meant a lot to me when we first moved up here, because I loved being isolated. I didn't take to living in town at all. So I loved it to begin with, but as I began to learn more about my neighbors and my church and the school and everything, I loved it even more. And my husband passed away 6 years ago. He had cancer, and somebody asked me if I was going to move back to Hart. And I said, well, no, I'm going to move back to Hart. I said, I hadn't lived there in 50 years.
What was Amistad like when you moved here?
A whole lot like it is right now. This little store was open. We had that little general merchandise, and you could get milk and eggs and a few canned stuff. And there was a gas station, you know, the old Adobe building that's right past here. We still had a mechanic and gas. And of course we had the post office. And that was it. That was it. We had school, and that kept the community together to have school. It really did. And then after we lost the school, small communities give up a lot when they lose the school.
When did the school close?
It closed in 2000. It had been a full 12-year school. And then in 1980, the last graduation class graduated, and it went from that to a grade school. And then in about 70, it closed in 2000, about 1995, we had lost down so that we had to, we put notices in newspapers and online and everything saying that people that had school-age kids could come to school here and have their rent free. If you had 4 kids, it was rent free. If you had 3 kids, it was $50 a month. If you had and on like that, and we've got out of that article that we put in, we probably picked up 15 kids. And we probably by that time didn't have about 15 going. So it doubled the size of the school. And that worked for us for about 6 years as a charter school. And then we wasn't an independent school district. We were under Clayton. And the inspectors come and what do you call it? Condemned. They condemned the building. And so when they did, they was just going to tear it down. And we said, well, I don't think so. That's not going to happen. So we made several trips to Santa Fe. The whole community would load up and head to Santa Fe. And we had hearings, and we met in front of the political people that are supposed to know what's going on. And finally, we played our ACE card. The gym had been designated a historical site, and the school was connected to the gym. And they said, okay, said you can't touch it, said you're going to have to repair it. So they kind of walked into it. Then they were committed to repairing it. So they spent almost $1 million on that school, repairing it and cleaning the asbestos out of it and tearing down the north wall in the gym and rebuilding it. And then within another probably year, it closed. So we've got a really nice community building.
So what is it used for today?
Well, like Chester and his bunch, the outsiders play basketball once a week. And we have New Year's dances. And we have the fall carnival. And we have showers in Vacation Bible School. And it's used pretty much. And they've got a sewing class going now. There's a sewing class over there that the women come and sew. And quite a few times we've used it for wedding receptions because the church is kind of small. So they'll have the wedding here and then have the reception over there. So we use it a lot. We're very fortunate to have it. Just too bad we hadn't got any school kids. I was at the meeting when they decided they were talking about whether to try to keep it open another year or two or close it. And I said, I can't see any reason to keep it open any longer. I said, it had got where there might be one child in one class and civic class and maybe two in the next class, and it wasn't a real viable school, I didn't think, although it had a lot of good things about it. But that night I went home and wrote down everybody's name in the community that had children and how old they was, and projected it into the next 6 years, and it was going to stay the same. It was going to struggle along with 5 or 6 students. And you just can't have school if you don't have kids. You've got to have kids.
But at the same time, that school was so important for you guys to save. So what does that school mean to you?
Oh, it means a lot. I mean, people just, especially the kids that have gone there. And we got the kids involved in it too, and we were trying to save it. I know my son loaded up with the superintendent and principal from Clayton, and they went around and visited the people in the area, in the school district, in this district, to see if they planned on to continue sending their kids there, or if they was going to send them to Clayton or Logan or Texline. And so the kids were real instrumental in learning why they did all they could to keep it open, but it wasn't enough. It wasn't enough.
So could we shift gears a little bit and talk about agriculture? So when you moved here, what were you and your husband doing?
We were farming.
What were you farming?
Pretty well cotton, wheat, and milo. And so when we moved up here, it went to wheat and milo because this is a little too far north for cotton, and there weren't any cotton gins, so we had to haul cotton for a long ways to do the gin.
Was it just you and your husband and your children, or did you hire out?
We had a hired hand that come with us, and he was a black man, and he took one look up here and he said, I must be the only black guy up here. He wasn't married. We brought his little trailer, we pulled the little trailer behind the pickup. And he had worked for us already for a year, and we just loved him. He was so much fun, and he just loved my kids, and they kept him company. So anyhow, he stayed from January till October. And he did find some friends in Dalhart that he'd go see every now and then. But, you know, he just never did feel comfortable. And he went back. He went back. But that's the only time we've ever had a hand. After that, the boys was old enough to help my husband farm, and so they started driving the tractor and farming.
Did you do any center pivot irrigation?
Not until about 12 years ago. We irrigated with tubes out of the ditch. Have you ever seen that?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's and when we first come, there wasn't very many irrigated farms here. We drilled 4 wells when we got here, and there was no pivots at all. It was all done with just roll water.
Mm-hmm. So when did that start to change?
Well, it probably 20 years ago is when they really come in. It just almost changed overnight too. It went from just raw water to pivots, just overnight practically, within 2-3 years.
And how did that impact your agriculture?
It made it a lot easier because you could just turn that pivot on, and all you had to do is check your wells twice a day. And with the raw water, and depending on what size the field was and how fast the water run through, sometimes you had to change it 3 times a day, and that made it one time during the night. I know one time my husband had gone up to change water real early in the morning. We were watering wheat, so it was real cold. And in fact, there was frost on everything, and he went before breakfast. He'd go change the water, and then he'd come back, and he had laid the canvas. The canvas is what you put in a ditch to keep the water from going. He'd laid the canvas he was fixing to use that morning, right where he was fixing to change the tubes, and it was just barely daylight. And he picked up the canvas, and there was a man under it.
Where did he come from?
From Narrabassa. The word had got around for several years. The wetbacks would come in, hop a train, and come to this area because up here where there's so many ranches, they'd hire him for a while, sometimes a long while. And he'd heard it, you know, through the grapevine that he could find work up here. And so James said he was so cold. He said he was just miserable. And he brought him to the house, and we fed him breakfast. And of course he couldn't speak a word of English. And my middle daughter was taking Spanish in school. She was a freshman, I think, then, or sophomore. So James said, "Can you say something in Spanish to him?" And Rhonda said, "The only thing I know how to say is what time is it?" He said, "I don't think that's going to work." So anyhow, we had a neighbor that we knew hired a lot of hands, and so James took him over there and they hired him. But that was kind of a surprise. A few times he's picked up a canvas and there was a rattlesnake under it, but that's the first time he ever picked up one and have a human.
So did the center pivot change the crops that you actually grew?
Yes, it made him better. It really did.
But you were growing the same stuff?
We were growing the same thing. We didn't change crops at all.
And then you said you had cattle too, so when did you get cattle?
We bought cattle when we moved here.
Okay.
We've always had, part of the place is farmland, but most of it's pasture. So we bought cattle when we first come here.
And did you help with the ranching or the agriculture?
You know, not a whole lot. Like I say, when the kids was all little, I had my hands full in the house. I have helped move equipment around and, you know, just honeydew jobs, but not as far as, I don't think I've drove a tractor since I've been up here. I used to drive it when I was a kid. I remember one time I was driving the tractor when I was in high school, and my older brother, I saw him racing up through the field and the dirt was just a-flying, and he pulled up beside the tractor, and it kind of worried me because I thought something had happened. And he said, "Turn off that tractor and get off of it." a guy had got struck by lightning.
Oh, wow.
About 5 miles driving the tractor. He knew it was time to go to the house.
Yeah.
So, but no, I haven't really drove a tractor since I've been married.
So what was it like, since you didn't work on the farm, raising kids in a farmhouse or in this community?
Well, like I say, the boys was in the 4th and 5th grade when we come here. So they were either at school or in the summertime having my husband. And when school started, then there was after school basketball practice, and they were in 4-H, and it was a typical, like it is now, I spent all my time running from one place to the other. It was fun. I loved it.
So Peggy, how many of your kids have stayed in this sort of business, ag or ranching business?
Just my youngest son and my daughter that married Randy. That's what they do. And then my other daughter moved back to Hart. She married a farmer from where we had come from. So I guess it'd be Rhonda and Barbara and Jimmy. So half of them is still in the ag business. So they're all farmers and ranchers.
Your other 3 kids that aren't in farming and ranching, what do they do?
Lynn works for the AMCO out here. That plant, I don't know if you saw it, but when we was at Chester and Yolanda's, about 3 miles down the road, this is the largest field of CO2 gas in the United States. And when they discovered it in about, gosh, I guess it was about 1980, I believe is when that field went in. And Lynn was already, he had graduated from college by that time. And he was already working for an oil company down at Hobbs, New Mexico. And when they started putting this CO2 field, he moved back. So he's fixing to retire in January. He's worked here for 30 years. And so he's in that line of business. And then my oldest daughter has moved to Sunray, which is real close to, it's just over into Texas. And she had married a farmer and rancher, but her and her husband, they didn't have any children. They had got a divorce, so she moved to the Dumas Sunray area because there's a lot of jobs over there. So she's married to a retired. He did cable work, putting cables, so they're not connected with agriculture. And then my other son was an entomologist, and so he was really connected with the ag culture, but he got killed in a car wreck when he was 37. So even though he wasn't farming, he was closely connected to the farm business.
And you've kept your farm.
Yes.
So what does it mean to you to have so many people in your family being farmers, and you've decided to keep your farm even though you're renting some of your land off for other people who are using it?
Yeah, land is precious. We would probably sacrifice a lot to keep our land, but thank goodness it's all paid for. And like I said, my youngest son is fixing to go into business now with his 2 son-in-laws, and that's exciting because they're young. And this last January, when because one of the son-in-laws had always he was a cowboy, and his daddy was a cowboy, and they just worked on ranches from one place to the other. And of course, their dream is to be the foreman of a ranch because it's a lot more stable work. So he was the foreman of a couple of ranches after they got married, but the ranch he was on sold. That happens often. And my youngest son and him talked about it, and they've decided that they can make a go of it with and they're going to change their crop deal too. We're going to have cattle and hay grazer and just in milo, things that they can bale. We won't have any more corn. And we'll have wheat and milo and hay grazer. And we're hoping so in January they moved from where they's at. Moved in with me for 4 months while they was waiting for their manufactured home to be brought out here. That was quite an expedition. They moved in the middle of January. Okay. With 1 rabbit, 5 cats, 7 dogs, 8 horses, 1 big boat,
It's a lot of company.
3 horse trailers, 4 pickups, all their furniture, all their food. Yeah, it was fun. That's the girl was here a while ago.
So we talked about the Dust Bowl, but what was the worst drought you can remember?
Well, this last one was the worst one. This that we're just now come out of.
So how
This
did
last
it
one.
impact your family?
Well, there was 2 or 3 years that we had to sell our calves real early. Instead of selling them in like the end of October or November, we had to sell them in August. We never did have to sell down our herd. We couldn't increase it though. I mean, you just had to hang on to what you had. You couldn't increase your herd at all. And so that was, of course, selling them earlier, the calves weighed less. One thing that saved us was cattle got high, and that was a good thing. And it changed the, we had to be really, really careful not to overgraze, because we knew if you overgraze that grass, it takes years for it to come back. So we had to be very conservative and feed a lot of feed. We didn't depend on just the pasture. We had to buy lots of feed during that time, because we didn't raise any hay or anything. We had to buy it all. Had to buy cake, molasses, and so that impacted your income. And, but yeah, this last drought was brutal. It was bad for Union County.
Do you remember the drought from the 1950s?
Yeah,
How did that impact
that wasn't too good either. Of course, we didn't live here in the 50s, but we suffered under the same kind of weather, because Hart is 150 miles south of here. So what affects this area pretty well goes right on down to, as long as you stay on the panhandle, it's pretty well the same.
So what are some lessons you learned to help yourself deal with drought? What are some lessons you've learned? Like, because you've gone through all these different droughts, starting from being born in the dirty 30s. What are some things that you've learned to cope with drought?
I think probably the most valuable lessons I learned them from my mother, because she lived through the Depression and the Dust Bowl. And so she was a very, very conservative person. Like they say, you didn't throw anything away, you used it, and if you wore it out, you patched it and kept using it. So it was almost part of my genes, to know how to get by on very little. And so we just incorporated that. We didn't go to town very often. We didn't, when gas got high, that was hard. When gas got high up here where you had to travel so far, so we had to cut back on a whole lot on how much. I mean, my grandkids was in high school then, and like I say, I loved basketball. And we had to just kind of pick and choose which basketball games we'd go to. We had been going to all of them if they was within 100 miles. But during that drought, then where we was cutting every penny we could. You cut down on your going, you cut down on how much you eat out. But everybody's in the same boat, and so it wasn't all that bad. You just adjusted to it. But I owe a whole lot of it to the way I was raised by my mother and my daddy, because they knew how to be conservative and pinch pennies.
In what ways do you think that this last drought is similar to that of the 1930s?
Well, I'm sure it's a lot different, because nowadays the farmers had a better way of working their land. They had the tractors that would plow the fields to keep them from blowing. So we didn't have the dust, we didn't have the dirt. We had the drought, but not the dust bowl. And that made a huge difference, because we was able to hang on to our topsoil. And of course, we were always irrigated farmers. And so we always had crops. But the ones that it really impacted was this last drought, where they had just dryland farms. And like Chester was saying this morning, you flat couldn't raise anything. And it was a long drought. It didn't just kind of come and go.
Are there still ever dust storms that come through
Yeah,
here?
every now and then. Yeah, every now and then we'll still have a pretty bad dust storm. I know when my kids was in school. I think it was the last year that they were in school, so that would have been the drought in the 70s. The tumbleweeds and the dirt blew enough that the kids would have to get out, and instead of going through a cattle guard, they would be filled up with sand and tumbleweeds. They'd have to open a pasture gate around the cattle guards, and so it was bad then too. But it didn't last near as long as this last one did.
What other environmental changes do you notice? Have you noticed in your lifetime around here? In terms of vegetation or animals or water?
Well, one thing I have really noticed, when we first come up here, it was real unique for us to have deer, and of course there have always been antelope, but we never had any. And since then, we have got more wildlife now, a lot more than we did then. We've got a whole lot more deer. We've got bobcats and mountain lions and bears and foxes and lots of coyotes and and prairie dogs. And you know, we've got hunters that come. You know, like Yolanda said, they've got some coming from Arizona. We've got some coming from Oklahoma and New Mexico. And they're amazed at how much wildlife there is. You don't see it as you go down the road, but they're here.
Why do you think that's changed?
Because the ranchers have been feeding them cake and mineral and water.
But were they doing that before?
Not as much.
Okay.
Used to, they had to kind of be on their
That's
own. Yeah, because the ranching business has changed a lot. Used to, you had a few bundles, and you had to, you know, you fed the bundles and they eat them up immediately.
Mm-hmm.
Now then you put out minerals
Right,
in
so then they have
tubs,
extra
and you
food.
provide water for them. And so the wildlife has done very well.
What about the vegetation? Is it different? The grasses or the weeds or the flowers or?
I can't tell much difference. Now there is, this last drought caused some of the pastures that were overgrazed. The tumbleweeds really got at them, bad. And it was from people that had to sell their herd, and there wasn't any cattle in on it. And they got to be a huge problem. We never did have that down here, but around Clayton and Sedan, last year the tumbleweeds were terrible. They just almost made it impossible to get up and down the roads, and even in Clayton, the tumbleweeds would block the alleys, so they couldn't even read the meters. It was unreal. I'd never seen it like that before, and it was due to the drought, though.
Yeah.
So you mentioned hunters coming in. Would you say that there's a lot of tourism here related to hunting or agriculture?
Yeah, there is. The hunting part of it helps the economy of this county. It really does, because there's a lot of people come in from the area and they spend money eating at the cafes, and they spend money at the motels and buying gas, and the hunting has helped. And then we have more tourists than you'd think. People, you know, since there's so many people that go on vacations, like I say, every now and then somebody comes through here. They want to get off of the main highways. They get off I-40 and they get off of, 83 going to Clayton and Trinidad. And so they stop and look and visit, and a lot of people that had people that was raised here come back. This last, you was here when we interviewed Helen. They were from Indiana, and Helen was 97 years old, and she wanted to come back to Amistad because she'd been born here. And they come back, and
passing through.
Yeah, you just happened to be passing.
Yeah.
It was a good interview.
It was a good interview. Yeah. What about the water? Has that changed at all around here?
A little, not as much as you hear that it has. There is places where it's a lot weaker. Now around Sedan, that's north of here, they have lost a lot more of their underground water than we have. But my daughter Barbara and her husband, they've been working with that water project for the last, I think 7 years, where they've been measuring. They measure the water in January and then again in August after irrigation season has shut down. And some of the wells have lowered a few inches, but not like you'd think. Not like you'd think. So I don't know. We'll just keep hoping and praying, because if we ever run out of water here, this will turn back to the all-American desert.
So how has agriculture or ranching changed in your lifetime? What are the big changes you see?
Well, like I say, just a lot bigger equipment and better equipment, and the cattle. My daddy used to have to grow bundles and put up bundles to feed cattle. Now then, if you run out of feed, well, you just pick up the phone, get a truckload of cake, they bring it. Or the big ranchers do that. We're not that big, but the big ranchers, you've seen those big overhead bins. They just go fill it up and go out there and pull a chain and go feed it.
So do you think it's easier or harder now to be a rancher or a farmer?
Oh, I think it's a lot easier. I think it's a lot easier due to the better equipment and more access to better feed for cattle, and just, I don't know, just you're so connected with the studies that the colleges do, you know, comes out all the time. Well, this works better, and you know, this feed is, do it like this, and it's just ongoing. Actually, it's an ongoing education. They have to stay really informed to stay on top of things. And they do. Our young farmers are really plugged into that new system. That's the reason my husband decided he didn't want to farm anymore. When the tractors come out with all the computers on them, and it was so different to him. But it was time for him to retire anyhow.
So what do you think the future of farming or ranching looks like in this community, in this region?
I think it still looks good. I really do. I think it's. I think we're probably in an industry that we're not going to be replaced, and it's still done a whole lot like it always has been, as far as same crops, same cattle. We have. They have learned that the ranchers have learned what kind of cattle they need to be raising. There were some of them that tried those exotic brands that didn't work very good. They went right back to either Herefords or Angus. And you have to kind of raise the type of cattle that does well in a certain region. They got to, some of the ranchers got to love in those floppy-eared red Angus and that type. And they didn't have enough hair on them to keep them warm.
It gets cold out here.
So they abandoned that idea. So, you know, just that kind of stuff that you kind of trial and error sometimes. But, and a lot of it's just your informational age, where you just whip out your iPhone and push a button or two and it'll tell you what to do.
So how do you do trial and error while still staying safe? Because it could cost you your livelihood to make a mistake.
Well, yeah, you don't want to. You've got to. The most danger for row crops, for crops, is insects. And if you're not a big enough operator to hire an entomologist to tell you when to spray and what to spray, well, then that's kind of trial and error. You more or less have to depend on your whoever's selling the chemical to tell you what's working the best on them. But yeah, the insects it can be a disaster.
So if you're not big enough, what do you do then?
You just kind of, it's word of mouth. You know, they get together, you know, and that's something else. Although our guys don't really get together. There's not a coffee shop to, you know, go drink coffee in every morning and exchange ideas. Now that's where I come from. That was the difference. Everybody went to the cafe and talked about how the crop was doing, and they'd say, "Oh, I tried this and it really worked," or "It really didn't work." But up here, they do most of their visiting at like brandings and gathering cattle and on the side of the road. The ranchers are really, that's always amazed me, because we didn't have ranches where I come from. And the guys that ranch up here, it's such a close-knit bunch because they work together. They work together during spring when they're when they're Brandon.
Mhm.
Then they work again. Sometimes if they're moving cattle, they have to call the neighbors and they come in. And I just love to sit around and listen to them talk because they know the horses' names like they would know their children's names.
Mhm.
And they know their pastures are named. And they call their pastures by name. And it may be a rancher that you never have happen maybe twice a year, but you still know his horses' names and the names of his pasture. That's just kind of fascinating to me.
So do you think that farmers and ranchers working together kind of adds to that sense of community that you feel in Amistad?
Probably, yeah, I think that's part of it.
So how far does the Amistad community stretch? Is it just here or?
Well, we claim, of course, the school kind of helped us out when we had school because we knew how far the buses run, and they were all part of the community. And since we don't have school here anymore, we still have a real vibrant church here that they come from far and wide. And it goes pretty well about 35 miles west. And then used to, we had a lot of kids coming from Texas to school because we're just about 12 miles from the state line. And so it would go over into Texas as far as, probably as far as 20 miles. And then it goes plumb to where the creek is, where y'all cross the creek. The community goes that far. And then about halfway between here and Nervasa, it goes that far. So it's 24 miles from here to Nervasa, so I'd say 15 miles south. It covers a wide area.
So what do you think binds the community of Amistad together?
Probably mostly because they're all in the same business together. And so they have a lot in common. That binds them together. There's not but one church. So if they're church-going people, they all come to this church. And like I say, the men working together, they get to be real close to one another. And just because we're so far, we have to like each other. We're so far from anybody else.
So what advice would you give to future generations, whether it be farmers or ranchers or even your own grandchildren?
Well, like I say, my two granddaughters and their husbands have just now started the ranching and farming operation with us, and it makes me very happy because I want my grandkids to experience, or my great-grandkids now, to experience the same kind of life that we had, because I just feel like it's the best way in the world to live. And like Crystal's here today, she's one that lived with me for 4 months while they was getting their manufactured home in. And of course, her mother and daddy and we're very positive about this kind of life, or we wouldn't be encouraging them to borrow a lot of money to buy a lot more cattle, to buy tractors to do this. So we're excited. We're off on another generation of working our land and raising cattle on it. And so we encourage them to stay close to the land because it's been good to us.
Okay. Well, thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you. Appreciate it.